Hi, I'm Kaylee. I'm in recovery from decades of disordered eating, and I actually really do like talking about the recovery process because it can feel kind of isolating and kind of taboo or shameful for a lot of folks. I know that was true for myself, and I'm still kind of working through that, honestly. I'm about 9 months into my own, full experience of recovery. I wrote some notes so that I stay on topic because I have a tendency to get a little long-winded. So you'll see my eyes dart over to the screen right beyond the camera phone. So let's dive in. This is a conversation about how recovery, in my experience, is simultaneously pretty simple and also very, very, very complex. So I want to talk about that. I hope you hear something that's helpful in this conversation. And just as a FYI, whether or not you have a formal diagnosis of an eating disorder or not, you deserve a peaceful relationship with food and with your body. People who think that they're just dieting are often engaged in disordered behaviors, and it's only because of our culture's weight stigma that those behaviors don't always look like red flags to everyone. Struggles with food are super common, and they are 100% not your fault. All right, I'm going to try and keep this conversation about my experience because I'm the only person that I can truly speak for. That said, my experience is mirrored to me by friends and family and strangers on the internet all of the time. Many of the patterns that I describe are not unique to me, which gets me to a very important point about disordered eating. Eating disorders are a biopsychosocial disease. This term was so key for my understanding of what I was experiencing. So I'm going to break it down just a little bit. Biopsychosocial means that there's 3 levels of influence and impact: biologically, physiologically, and genetically, psychologically, in the mind and the emotions, and sociologically, the interactions between individuals and the cultural environment they're a part of. It's very difficult to exist in our culture without having some tension or conflict in our relationship with food and with our body. The messages that we receive around food, eating, and our bodies from the world around us are often disordered and dysfunctional. In order to move toward a more peaceful relationship with food and my body, I had to look at all 3 of those layers: biological, psychological, and sociological. A really common place that I experienced tension in my relationship with food and my body was around how much I would eat. I remember this happening really early on, commiserating with a friend back in junior high about feeling out of control with how much food we were both eating. Looking back, it feels really obvious that we were going through puberty and also dipping our toes into dieting for the first time. So those two they're not super compatible. Our body's needs for energy were going up with puberty. Obviously, you're literally growing taller most of the time, and body systems are maturing, right? At the same time as we decided to jump on board with society's norm of dieting, which was a way of reducing our energy intake. So of course, we ended up binge eating. The binge eating was a symptom of the dieting and restriction. It wasn't something that was wrong with us. So it's really important to note that. A lot of the time, binge eating is seen as a maladaptive coping mechanism, hence the demonization of things like emotional eating. But in truth, dieting behavior is actually more of an emotional thing for a lot of people. Dieting stems a lot of the time from some mental and emotional discomfort around feeling like a need to fit in or feeling out of control with a changing body. For me, it was definitely those 2 things, and also like who I was as a girl turning into a woman in this world. It's a really awkward and pretty uncomfortable phase for a lot of folks. people diet for all kinds of emotional reasons, usually rooted in some version of feeling not good enough. It's pretty sad, right? As a culture, we don't get too concerned or care to look at why people don't feel included in the first place or why they don't feel good enough in the first place. And rather, we tend to applaud their efforts at dieting for the sake of health or for the sake of shrinking their body. We don't feel upset individually or collectively a lot of the time until we overeat. So let's pause there and just take a moment to think about how we define that term overeat. Sometimes we might refer to it as binge eating. And I think it's important to point out that there's a little bit of a problematic nature in this idea of overeating. What do we mean when we say overeat? Like ate over an arbitrary 2,000 calorie a day recommendation, ate over the amount of some diet plan that we've internalized, ate over MyFitnessPal's recommendations, fill in the blank for whatever diet. I'd love to name names, but I won't get into that here. So it's kind of an unhelpful concept, especially if we've mentally created a construct around how much food we should eat as less than what we actually physiologically, biologically need. So there's the biological piece, right? Where am I in my notes here? If we're talking about binge eating, there's actually a definition for that. It's defined as eating an amount of food that is definitely larger, again, this is arbitrary, definitely larger than what most people would eat in a similar period of time under similar circumstances. Binge eating is accompanied by a sense of feeling a lack of control. So looking at these terms a little bit objectively and starting to get curious about the associations that we have with them is really important and helpful, in my opinion. Someone pointed out that we are actually at least as likely to emotionally diet, right? To restrict our food for emotional reasons as we are to emotionally eat. And it's less common for people to be guilted or shamed about restricting their food, even if it's a way of coping with an uncomfortable emotional or mental state. The other thing worth mentioning is that our concept of what a large amount of food is can get warped from dieting or disordered eating. Early in my recovery, what most people would think of as a normal sized meal sometimes felt like a large amount of food and even a binge to my eyes. I needed a lot more food than I thought was necessary after years of restriction, and way more food than most diets that I've seen. It makes sense that someone has been doing any kind of restriction, whether that's intermittent fasting, dieting, or even just this watching what you eat or trying to cut back a little. It makes sense that you would over time develop a skewed perception of what constitutes a large amount of food. So this expectation of eating and needing less food while dieting is at direct odds with the biological phenomena that occur when the body enters an energy deficit as a result of dieting or restricting your intake. Someone who's restricting in any way may notice that they start to have more thoughts about food and the desire or urge to eat larger amounts of food than they ever did before they engaged in any dieting behaviors. I think this kind of eating, when you eat a large amount of food after engaging in dieting behaviors, we might call this overeating or binge eating, but it's way more appropriate to call that kind of eating responsive eating because it's happening in response to restriction. I don't want to ignore that there are often emotional components that accompany the behavior of eating a lot of food. I think the psychological and emotional part of binge eating is often the primary focus, though, of a lot of therapeutic interventions, and it absolutely needs to be tended to, absolutely. But it's essential for recovery that we unpack what's going on physiologically as well. And that physiological drive can actually be way more significant and powerful than the psychological component. So, in order for the body to find equilibrium after food restriction, it's very common to need to eat a large amount of food. It can be scary to honor that need for some people. Myself, it was necessary part of my healing, and it was scary. And people that I confided in, some people told me that I was binge eating, and that I would just end up developing binge eating disorder. And this was even, unfortunately, a message that I occasionally got from eating disorder professionals on like treatment teams that I've worked with in the past, people like dietitians or therapists. I think really well-meaning people trying to help. Unfortunately, that message kept me stuck in this cycle for, I think, longer than I needed to be. So I don't think it's the case that I was developing binge eating disorder. I don't think I was even actually binging. I don't think of those episodes of eating where I was eating, I will just put it on the line here. I was eating several thousand calories in a sitting a few times a day. So sometimes in a single day, up to 7,000 to 8,000 calories in just one day. And then the same thing the next day for a couple weeks or even a few months, off and on. I genuinely wanted that much food. And I know that that was vital to this process. I didn't feel out of control while I was doing that. To the contrary, it felt therapeutic. And I guess it felt intuitive in a way as well. There was a part of me that knew that that needed to happen. And I know that my physiology was in a very different state in those early weeks and months of the recovery process, because at this point I feel zero desire to eat like that. It's not like I'm controlling that urge or staying on top of it or anything. I genuinely don't want to eat that much food anymore, because I'm not in that level of an energy deficit. There's a lot of scientific research to back this experience up. This is why I say this is a pattern that's not just my experience. It has to do with hunger and fullness cues from the body that are upregulated when you're in an energy deficit, also known as dieting, and downregulated when you're consistently well nourished. So this is where it's kind of like, it's really simple as well, right? So there's pieces of this puzzle that are super simple, and that doesn't mean that they're easy at all, because they're connected to so many other, sometimes more complicated parts, like the sociological part. And that's kind of where we're headed next. Eating a large amount of food is socially associated with really uncool stigma. It comes down to a lot of the time an anti-fat bias or a moralistic kind of puritanical view around health. It can feel incredibly frightening during and after an episode of what's known as extreme eating. Sometimes you can think of it as a binge if you want, or overeating. The anxiety or fear response that we feel after we quote unquote overeat or binge is really important to investigate. I already kind of gave it away, right? That it comes down to anti-fat bias and healthism. Because biologically, that sense of fear when you eat a large amount of food doesn't make a lot of sense. It's pretty misdirected to be afraid of something that's literally vital to your existence. A large amount of food from a purely physiological perspective is probably a good thing if we're thinking about survival and how an organism works, whether that's a human or any organism, any animal for that matter. Having a large volume of food, a large volume of energy that you get to take in, it's typically a pretty good thing, right? Like getting enough energy or even getting a surplus of energy that you can store is conducive to survival. I read something just a few moments ago that like it's almost as if the body isn't meant to be an aesthetic thing. It's actually an instrument for experiencing life and our world through. So, biologically, hopefully, we can buy into this idea that eating, including large amounts of food, isn't that scary. This hopefully kind of addresses the bio part of that biopsychosocial model of eating disorders. We still have to look at the psychological and sociological components, which tend to be, in my experience, the much more complex, layered pieces of this puzzle. So the fear that we feel around eating a large amount of food often boils down to a fear of weight gain. It's conditioned for most of us, and it comes from being exposed to social constructs and genuine harm that's inflicted on people in larger bodies. Seeing the way our culture treats individuals makes it absolutely justified to not want to be subjected to the stigma that comes to being in a bigger body. This is why it's really important to recognize that eating disorders, disordered eating, and dieting aren't your fault. They're often an attempt to feel like you belong. To feel like you belong in a dysfunctional human family, and to stay safe in a world that's pretty harmful and unkind in the midst of social constructs that attack people who don't fit the mold. Social systems exhibit an unfair anti-fat bias that puts pressure on people in all body sizes, disadvantaging people in direct proportion to their deviation from the thin ideal. So the farther away from that like mythical perfect body that you are, the more discrimination and disadvantage that you experience. This is outright wrong. It's horrible. It's like heartbreaking. I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's stay on topic. Let's see. So people in the largest bodies experience the most harm, and people of every size witness that discrimination play out. I know for myself, fear-mongering about quote-unquote obesity was a major contributor to the development of an eating disorder. In addition to the narrative of that obesity epidemic, there's also just your garden variety jokes about people's body size that pop up everywhere. For some reason, body size is still somehow a socially acceptable thing to ridicule in cartoons and sitcoms, on playgrounds and comedy. It's sad and it's not okay. It hurts everyone. And for someone trying to recover from disordered eating, that stigmatizing behavior contributes to a justified fear around potential weight gain, and therefore a fear of eating, especially eating large amounts of food, as someone in recovery from an eating disorder likely needs to do in order to fully recover and break that cycle. It's a conundrum. A huge part of the recovery process for me was just noticing that was what was going on. I think I actually lingered in that space of just noticing that was what was going on for, maybe a good solid year. This allowed me to start to be more discerning when fear or anxiety around food, especially large amounts of food, came up. The sociological part for me meant that I did not want to participate or be complicit in this type of stigmatization, which meant that I had to address my own fear of weight gain. This was truly the connection that was necessary for me in order to rally the courage and the willingness that I needed to recover. It didn't make the fear go away, so for the last part of this conversation, I'd like to share 2, maybe 3 things that actually helped me along the way, but I want to pause and acknowledge that I am in a straight-sized body, and for someone in a bigger body, doing this work may be significantly more frightening because of those social factors that I mentioned. No matter what size you are, you deserve recovery. You deserve a peaceful relationship with your food and with your body. And I hope that these practical tips are helpful. So, how to cope after or while you are eating a large amount of food. The first thing that I did after or during meals sometimes, to remind myself that I was safe was really just to remind myself that I was safe. When that fear would come up, I would literally say to myself, not really out loud usually, but I would literally say to myself, I'm safe. It's okay to relax. I'm safe. It's okay to feel full. I'm safe. It's okay to eat the thing. I'm safe. It's okay to let go, right? To let go of that control, to let go of those restrictions. That actually went a long way for me because so much of this experience is going on inside of the body. And if you can take the tension level in the body down a notch or two, it makes everything a little bit easier. This is also a little side benefit, really key if you're experiencing any digestive distress. The bloating and the discomfort that most people experience with recovery is exacerbated by stress and fear. Your body is way better at digesting when it's relaxed and feels safe. So literally we're tapping into that parasympathetic side of the nervous system that's colloquially referred to as the rest and digest side. I am safe. You are safe. Hopefully that's true. And hopefully the majority of the lack of safety that you feel is mental. And that's where that reminder just to yourself can be so powerful to start to untangle that internalized conditioning that might be contributing to making this work a lot harder. The next thing that I did that helped was to redirect that fear, that anxiety, that stress onto something more appropriate, Sometimes reading notes actually makes it harder for me to talk, but I'm going to stick with it so I stay on topic. The more appropriate place to put your fear is, I guess it's not really fear, the more appropriate place for that emotional kind of response to land is onto the social constructs that contributed to the development of an eating disorder in the first place. Let yourself feel whatever you feel about this. Anger, grief, sadness, heartbreak, whether it's social systems at large, or maybe you have really tragically people or influencers in your life who have put pressure on you to fit into a mold that your body and your authentic personality don't want to fit into. And it's appropriate to feel some feelings about that. It's appropriate to feel angry. It's appropriate to grieve. For me, the big thing, a lot of it was just feeling heartbreak, because it's heartbreaking to see the way that the world is sometimes. There's obviously a lot of good in the world, absolutely. But there's a lot of pretty nasty, harmful, painful stuff as well, and that is heartbreaking. It just is. So there's a reflex around those hard feelings that makes you want to kind of turn away from it. And for me, I get upset with myself, or I want to find a distraction. But I think we have to experiment with staying present with the harder emotions, whether they're grief or heartbreak, fill in the blank for you. If we truly mean to create a better world someday, we have to feel some of the consequences of the not great parts of the world the way it is. Let's see, where am I? When things are heartbreaking, social justice is heartbreaking, it makes sense to feel that response. You can think like if you were at a funeral and you didn't want to let yourself feel grief or sadness, but that was how you were feeling, it's okay to feel that. It's part of the full spectrum of human emotion and experience, and feeling those feelings from a place of alignment where they're justified is actually a sign of health. Forcing yourself to feel something else or to distract can be pretty out of touch and ends up just perpetuating the dysfunctional social constructs that contributed to our suffering in the first place. When you let yourself feel the truth of whatever you feel without any judgment, even those painful feelings can be healing and health promoting. So those are two kind of mindset things that I did. Those pieces, telling yourself you're safe and redirecting negative feelings away from yourself, away from the food, and onto the social constructs that we need to dismantle. Mindset shift, like 180, makes things a lot easier when you're not at war with what you're eating or your body, and instead you're taking those feelings and putting them where they belong. Even if you go through the motions of recovery, like even if you're doing all of the right things, stopping the behaviors, yada, 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 if you don't cultivate a new mindset, it's so hard to sustain just behavior change without changing how you think about things. It's also way less rewarding if you don't change your beliefs. So mindset work, super important, maybe even like prerequisite in a way to behavior change, unless you just want temporary behavior change. The last thing that's super important after a binge or overeating, quote unquote, on both of those terms, is to resist the urge to compensate in any way. I know this is hard. I think I went back and forth with this for probably, this is painful to admit, but probably like 15 years, honestly. The fear that sometimes comes up after eating a large amount of food can often be temporarily mediated with some form of purging or compensating behavior, whether that's vomiting, laxative abuse, over-exercising, fasting, or even this, again, letting the mind do something that feels helpful in the moment, but actually just perpetuates the cycle, is planning the next diet or telling yourself that you're going to be good at your next meal, or that you'll skip your next meal and get on track tomorrow, yada, yada, yada. That kind of thought process that in the moment can take the sting out of that stress or fear that you're feeling, but it really just keeps you stuck in that cycle. It's a trap. As soon as you entertain the idea of restriction or compensation, you're basically restarting that cycle of energy imbalance, which will likely just lead to more urges to binge. I did this for years, so absolutely no judgment if you're in that cycle. If you can resist the urge to soothe yourself with thoughts of restriction, if you can give yourself full permission to eat, as soon as you feel hungry again, that's how you're going to rebuild trust with your body. So what I did was commit to eating again as soon as I felt hungry. If you've been restricting or you've been in an energy deficit, it's possible and even pretty likely that even after eating what feels like a large quantity of food, you might feel hungry again sooner than you'd expect. So just for an example, let's say you've been restricting for a couple weeks and you're in an energy deficit of, we'll say, 20,000 calories, which is possible to do if you've been restricting for a couple weeks. And you sit down and the reins come off and you eat 5,000 calories in one sitting. You're still 15,000 calories short, right? If I did the math right there. So it's likely that you'll be hungry again. It can feel kind of scary and weird. Trusting the body is like rebuilding or starting a relationship really with somebody new, and it takes kind of taking a leap of faith at some point. So sometimes we need a lot more food than we think. That's kind of the bottom line. Practice those mentally healthy ways of self-soothing. Remind yourself, I am safe. It's okay to let go. It's okay to relax. It's okay to feel full. Knowing, trusting that your body is going to take care of whatever food you gave it. Your body is so wise. The energy from the food will get redistributed as intelligently as anything. You might get bloated, you might feel uncomfortable, and that's okay too. Lean into that relaxation response if you can to support your body's digestion. And then to circle back to the social justice piece, redirect the fear or the anxiety that might arise after eating a large quantity of food onto places that it's more appropriate. It's horrible that we give some people unfair advantages because of their body size and discriminate against others. And any level of participation in that kind of injustice is a way that we perpetuate an unkind and harmful social construct that contributes to disordered eating and people having really painful relationships with their body and painful interactions with something that could be a source of joy, right? Our food and our eating. One of the biggest motivations that I have and had for recovery is remembering that the work that I'm doing is actually about so much more than just me, that sociological piece. If I unsubscribe from harmful cultural norms and I start pushing back on the systems that tell me that in order to be liked or in order to be successful, I need to be thin and pretty and gender normative and whatever, I don't want to subscribe to that. The more people who opt out of it, the safer the world is for everybody. So stay strong, opt out of disordered behaviors as much as you can. Give yourself compassion along the way. Remind yourself that it's okay to eat a large amount of food often. And that's it for this lengthy little video. I just wanted to chat for a minute. I hope it was helpful, and please reach out in the comments if you have questions. Sending you lots of love. See you soon.